Good evening and welcome back to the HBCU Interfaith Conference. I can tell you that I have been blessed and we have all been blessed by the rich sessions, discussions, conversations that we have been able to embark on throughout this day. And we are grateful for our opening keynote address by Dean Richardson, Dr. Kanika Jones, as well as Dr. Nisa Muhammad. I want to extend our gratitude to Imam Evans of the American Learning Institute for Muslim, who led us in our Jummah prayer service. Of course, our gratitude is extended to Pastor Winston Harris, the director of the Office of Spiritual Development and Dialogue at North Carolina Central University, Dr. Nisa Muhammad again, and our student, Ms. Heyman, for their work and workshop on the interfaith best practices. And lastly, of course, to Dr. Jones and Chantel Williams, the president of our chapel assistants, who led us in challenges of doing interfaith work in and out of the Bible Belt. And we have been joined this evening by Dr. Eboo Patel, who will lead us in our closing keynote address following some remarks and a respondent from the faculty member, Dr. Kenyatta Gilbert. This evening, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing both Dr. Patel and Dr. Gilbert. Before we do that, we just want everyone to take a moment now and drop in the comments in the chat section where you're joining us from. We're so excited to have representation from over 40 institutions from across the country. And we know that you all are out there in the virtual world, and we just want to hear where you're from and how your day has been. So feel free to share a piece of what you might have learned in the session, or if there was a comment that you really enjoyed, feel free to share that as well. I'd like to introduce Dr. Patel at this time. Dr. Eboo Patel is the founder and president of the Interfaith Youth Corps, one of our sponsors for the HBCU Interfaith Conference. And this is a nonprofit organization that works towards making interfaith cooperation a social norm in America. He is a respected leader on national issues of religious diversity, civic engagement, and the intersection of racial equity, as well as interfaith cooperation. He has authored 4 books and dozens of articles, and is a frequent keynote speaker at colleges and universities, philanthropic convenings, and civic gatherings, both in person and virtually. He also served on President Obama's Inaugural Faith Council. We are richly blessed to be able to hear from Dr. Patel this evening, and we know that he has a rich word for us as we experience this time together. Dr. Patel?
Thank you so much, Reverend Duffy. It's great to be with you. So I want to begin with a bang here. The most inspiring and significant bridging of faith divides towards common humanistic ends has happened in Black communities. So why is interfaith work so white? I'm not being judgmental. I'm not even being critical. I'm just being descriptive. When you go to an interfaith conference, it is largely white and it feels white. But whenever people tell inspiring stories of interfaith work happening, you'll hear about Reverend Dr. King, you'll hear Barack Obama, you'll hear these important Black figures, but it is almost as if they are actors in a white play. So the focus of my brief remarks this evening is this: what does it look like to reclaim Black interfaith? What does it look like to recenter Black interfaith? What does it look like to lift up, build high and proud and tall and beautiful Black interfaith? Notice, I am not saying what does it look like created from scratch, because there is a marvelous, magnificent, wondrous tradition of Black interfaith that has existed from the beginning and that exists today. It's just not at the center. It's just not on the billboard. It's just not imagined as essential. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's just not a part of the story. So what does it look like to make it the center of the story? One of the ways to think about this is to reconsider our origins. Let me read to you from the great historian and writer Annette Gordon Reed, from her most recent book, which was just published. She writes this: origin stories matter for individuals, groups of people and nations. They inform our sense of self, telling us what kind of people we believe we are, what kind of nation we believe we live in. They usually carry at least a hope that where we started might hold the key to where we are in the present. The way interfaith work is too often imagined is as if it was invented by white people on this continent, as if it was the European founders, Jefferson and Madison and Franklin and Washington, who first thought about the bridging of religious divides, or before them, the European writers of the Flushing Remonstrance. Let me make it clear, I respect these people. I know they sinned. I know that they had grievous errors. I respect them on account of what they did for religious diversity, but they are not the beginning of the story. They are not the beginning of the story. So what is the beginning of the story? What might be the origin of interfaith work, which again, I'm using colloquially to mean the bridging of religious divides towards inspiring ideals or common humanistic ends? Annette Gordon-Reed brings us the figure of Esther Banico, who is a North African Muslim in the early 16th century, who serves as a translator for a Spanish exploration mission. I will put exploration in quotes there. But the translator for these European Spaniards was this Muslim from North Africa who engaged with the various indigenous peoples that they encountered, who learned their languages, who went back and forth between them. This is in the 1520s. It is 90 years, 90 years before John Rolfe lands at Jamestown with what he calls 20 and odd people of African descent. I, of course, here bring up the important work of Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is experiencing an injustice as we speak at the University of North Carolina, and her work in the 1619 Project. It's not the details of the work that concerns me most right now. It is the major question of how do we think of our origins? How do we think of where we come from and who we are? What if we think that the originators, the inventors of interfaith work in America were Black people? What if we considered amongst the pillars of interfaith work in America, alongside the Declaration of Independence and the Church of Savannah, Georgia, which is built by Christians and Muslims, which has Arabic script carved into the pews, which serves as a stop on the Underground Railroad? What if we view that as the anchor point for the beginning of interfaith work in the United States of America? And what if we considered the weave of religious diversity through Black movements from time immemorial? For example, in the Harlem Renaissance, Alain Locke, many consider the father of the Harlem Renaissance, converts to the Baha'i faith in 1918. In Selma, Montgomery, in Selma, Alabama, the fountainhead of the Great March from Selma to Montgomery, it is the great Malcolm X who comes and gives a speech at Brown Chapel. The blues, which is the fountainhead of all American music, along with jazz, there are ethnomusicologists who say that the blues comes from the field chants of slaves who heard the Adhan, the Muslim call to prayer, caught in it the blue note in the Adhan, translated it into their field chants, translated it into their music, and that is where American civilization comes from. This is the history of Black interfaith. And you are the next chapter. So what does that look like? What does it look like to claim this history? To know that your ancestry, your heritage is where the bridging of religious divides towards the highest ideals comes from. And it is up to you to write the next chapter. So what does Black interfaith look like in the arts? What does Black interfaith look like in family life? What does Black interfaith look like in social justice? What does Black interfaith look like in academia? What does Black interfaith look like in ministry? These are the kinds of questions that are being taken up by the Black interfaith group at IFYC, but also in all groups across the country, in all types of interfaith groups, at this conference, in community groups, in book groups, at dinner parties. What does it look like to reclaim the magnificent legacy of Black interfaith, to recenter that story, to build high from that legacy? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Patel, for really helping us to envision and to become enlightened to this idea of reclaiming the legacy of Black interfaith work. This evening, we're blessed to hear a reaction and a response from a member of the faculty at the Howard University School of Divinity, the Reverend Dr. Kenyatta R. Gilbert. Dr. Kenyatta Gilbert is an expert on African American preaching, a prolific writer, and often a featured expert on Black preaching, civil rights, and social justice. Dr. Gilbert has authored countless sermons as well as classroom lectures, and has also authored 4 books. His most recent, Just Living, Meditations for Engaging Our Life and Time. I had the opportunity earlier to speak a little bit about Dr. Howard Thurman, and Dr. Gilbert was an individual who introduced me to Dr. Thurman, and we're excited to have him as our respondent this evening. Dr. Gilbert?
And let me just first of all say what a delight it is to share this space with Dr. Patel. He is the guru of interfaith dialogue, and this is quite an honor. So let me first of all express my appreciation in that way. Thank you all, everyone else who's on this call, and for your presence today. I hope this has been a blessed experience for you. In response to Dr. Patel's positioning of this talk, which I think is very important, I want to be a jazz theologian, as Dr. Patel briefly shared with me before we logged on, as we logged on. And in doing so, I will riff just a bit off of what I believe is central to his concern. And that is, how do we center our own particular racial ethnic voice in conversations that are white dominated, or conversations where whiteness is perceived as the gold standard for thinking about faith, for thinking about the merits of one's own interaction with our culture and living in our culture. And so, first of all, I would say the fundamental thing when thinking about interfaith, Black interfaith in the context of world community, is to think about it in terms of who's telling the truth. Where can we locate truth? And I would argue that naming our own particular social location is a fundamental first step in identifying truth, and even stating our own truth claims, our ways of knowing, our perspectives, our normed way of seeing the world. And so if we are not able to retrieve cultural memory, if we're not able to honor the fact that we are human beings shaped by culture, we're not able to honor the fact that we are all historically conditioned by the cradle that has shaped and nurtured us, then I think we are certainly impoverished when we enter conversations where white presence dominates. And so, rather recently, I framed the question, and I want to read that question to you, and I think it has applicability to what we're talking about today. And in terms of interfaith cooperation, trying to see through the lens, again, of cultural particularity, as Black people, as diasporic people, as folk who have multi-layered experiences in skin that happens to be pigmented in shades that are dark and across the spectrum, if you will. My question that really intrigues me and will be the substance of my next work is this. If faith is grounded in love, and if love is the way, and I believe it is the way, at least my faith dictates that, can our ways of knowing and our religious practices be shaped to embody more fully the normative purposes of the faith tradition that is ours in an anti-racist, anti-imperialist, anti-authoritarian manner, and urge all persons who are justice-seeking and hope-seeking, irrespective of race, ethnicity, and subcommunity, toward a unified vision of beloved community? How do we get there from our spaces of particularity and then move into human cooperation from our various spaces of lived experience? And so I'd like to leave it there. If in fact I am to raise a question for Dr. Patel in an exchange, I'm happy to do that as well.
Excellent. And so we'll definitely bring Dr. Patel back on as well to engage in this dialogue. We have the opportunity to hear from the nation's best, not just in preaching, but in interfaith cooperation and understanding of social justice. So Dr. Gilbert, can you offer again the question to Dr. Patel that we might be able to discuss it together?
Sure. So it seems to me that the nature of this talk centers around whiteness. Mm. What does it mean to invade that space or to interpret that space through one's own grounding in the world? And so I guess my question would be, what are these barriers or obstacles that our world has presented us that diminishes our own sense of self or worth in the world, particularly as we enter these conversations about interfaith?
Mm. Yeah, thank you. So, thank you, Dr. Gilbert. It's a joy and a pleasure and an honor to be in conversation with you like this, to be jazz public theologian, so to speak. You know, so the way that I think the side of the coin that I proposed initially was if it is the case, and I think it's indisputable that the most inspiring the most inspiring action that bridged religious divides towards common humanistic ends emerged in Black spaces. The Harlem Renaissance is a Black space. The Civil Rights Movement is a Black space, right? First African Baptist Church, the Underground Railroad is a Black space. That doesn't mean it is exclusive. It's just particular. It's particular, right? If it is the case that the most inspiring bridging of religion divides emerge out of these spaces, why is it that interfaith conferences are so white? And again, that's simply being in my mind. It's not. I don't think of this. I'm struck by the verb you use, invade, right? Because I think to myself, actually, it is. I love the people who come to interfaith conferences, and they shouldn't feel like a white play in which other people are characters, right? And as a Muslim, one of the things that was really powerful for me was recognize. There's so much talk about how the origins of interfaith work is in 1893 at the Chicago Parliament of the World's Religions. That inspires me. But the truth of the matter is, there are miniatures, beautiful paintings from the 16th century of Jesuit priests and Hindu swamis in dialogue in the court of Akbar the Magnificent in India, right? So hundreds of years before the Parliament of the World's Religions, there were Muslims hosting interfaith dialogues. And actually, hundreds of years before that, there was a Buddhist emperor in India named Ashoka, who decrees that all religions are free in his land. This does not diminish the power of the Flushing Remonstrance and the wonderful people who stood up, the wonderful Europeans who stood up for the rights of Quakers in the 1650s. It only says that they didn't start it, right? It only says that in the case of me as a Muslim, I have an origin story that maybe actually predates other origin stories. That Black people have an origin story of interfaith work that predates others, right? And so, I think about Mos Def from Black on Both Sides. Now, of course, renamed Yasin Bey, right? We went from chain gang line hopping to bebopping to hip hopping. Invisible Man got the whole world watching, right? He's tracing the arc of a narrative. Like, we have an origin story called American in American arts. We invented things, and there have been new chapters of it, right? So I take the kind of frame of invading white space, and I think that there's positive uses for that. But I think that, like, my trumpet solo in response to your sax solo would be, what does it look like to reclaim an origin and kind of claim I mean, this is kind of a Baldwin move, right? Like claim, Baldwin's line, there's been so much talk of my people coming in. I am not a ward of this nation. I am one of the first Americans to arrive on these shores. Right. And if we thought of interfaith work as originating in the Black experience, then you walk into an interfaith conference and ask the question, it's actually kind of off that this is 80% white. Kind of off. And actually, the conversation that happens at my dinner table every night between the Christians and the Muslims and the African Hebrews and the people who are considering leaving the church, etc., and people who are saying that hip hop is a religion, that's an interfaith conversation, and why isn't that on stage here?
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. And just as a point of clarity, when I suggest invasion or cultural invasion, I'm essentially also saying that self-determination is key. Invading white space is to dethrone whiteness, if you will, because even in Black spaces that are, predominantly Black, that does not necessarily mean that whiteness has been eliminated in those spaces. It may suggest that the work of decolonizing our own ways of knowing and ways of thinking by reclaiming that which is our own origin story is the pathway forward. And quite clearly, I think you're right. I think if we're able to honor again our particular stories and share those as they are needed to be told, then we can have a better appreciation for those others who occupy human community. And if the larger pursuit is to be self-determined in our own right and respect to be people on the planet, then we have to find some ways in order to bridge those divides. Now, I'm intrigued by a discussion in Dr. Willie Jennings' book. You perhaps know of Willie Jennings, who is a theological educator now at Yale. whose work on whiteness, he simply suggests that, in these times, talking reconciliation is not very helpful if we're not coupling that or beginning that conversation with conversations around justice. And if those conversations are not authentically put forth and appreciated, then what we end up doing is using the language of reconciliation as a foil, if you will, to not really addressing injustice, but actually buttressing the status quo or keeping the status quo in place. So it's that pursuit of trying to honor the origins of one's particular story, but having access to that story, I think, is the work of many people of persons of color.
Yeah, if I could just say one more thing, I find that so powerful, because I think part of what we're doing is we're kind of collectively, like literally playing instruments on a stage and thinking, what's the best route here, right? Is it a foray into a decentering of whiteness, so to speak? Is it a reclaiming of a different origin story, right? Because one of the things that strikes me about The Fire Next Time so dramatically, right? The kind of arc of The Fire Next Time. I mean, there's like, you do a jazz orchestra on this, right? Baldwin, the beginning of the book is Baldwin understanding Elijah Muhammad's anger, right? And actually connecting it with his own experience, his own challenging experience as a gay man in the church, right? And feeling, and so it's this combination of anger about white racism and the kind of the patriarchy, the nature of the church. He feels that anger, and he finds himself at Elijah Muhammad's table, a hot night in 1963. I think it's July 1963. And he hears Elijah Muhammad's worldview, which is effectively a decentering an invasion against whiteness worldview. And he thinks to himself, I don't really want to live in this world. I understand your anger, but I don't want to live in your world, right? Like your world has no place for me. And so the end of the book is Baldwin, and of course I'm saying things that everybody knows. I'm effectively going through a narrative that we all know very well. I'm fully aware of that, right? The end of the book is Baldwin grappling with, okay, how do you move forward when you are angry, but you don't want to live in the worldview of that anger? You understand the anger, but you don't want to live in the world that the anger creates, right? And I think what Baldwin does is he first of all says, what I have is America. I need to push this country, but in pushing it, I'm gonna think about the origins in a different way, right? And I'm going to think of myself not only as coming in chains, but coming first. I'm the fountainhead, right? Nobody comes before me. And actually what Annette Gordon-Reed does in this recent book is she says 100 years before the first Black people arrived, the first Black people really arrived. We are really the first. And actually, we were praying in Arabic.
Yeah.
Right? And so I am not moving my furniture in the room and moving yours around. My furniture's been here. It's just invisible. And I'm going to take my seat, and I'm an equal. Now let's talk. It's kind of a reconceiving of origins. I'll do one more kind of jazz move here and see, and then turn it over to you to close us out, or to Reverend Duffy, who's like, I got a time limit, man. What do you do? So look, I'm, my friends and colleagues, Don and Janet are part of this. They must be like, what has happened to Eboo? What has happened to my guy Eboo, right? Like he's this like moderate dude who makes everybody feel comfortable. He's gone rogue on us, and I realized that part of my complicity in this is I've only told one origin story. And what I don't want to displace Washington and Jefferson and Madison and Franklin. I want to say they weren't the only first ones. There were many people who were first. There are many forms of furniture in the room. So I think it is remarkable that Roger Williams in the middle of the 17th century comes as a Puritan minister to Boston and then decides he doesn't want to live in Calvin's theocracy in Boston, and he leaves and he becomes an originator of European-based religious freedom, founds Rhode Island, et cetera, et cetera. And I will often tell the story of how remarkable Roger Williams was. And amongst the things that he did was he made friends with the Native American tribes of Rhode Island, the Narragansett, and he learned their languages and he appreciated their cosmology. But you know what I've never done until now? Is said, how remarkable is it that these Native American tribes were happy to be friends with this European dude escaping from Boston? That they learned his language, that they accepted him, right? That they are actually original too, maybe even more original. That American interfaith work comes both from Roger Williams and the Narragansett, comes both from Thomas Jefferson and from Estebanico, comes both from the First Amendment and from the First African Baptist Church. And to be able to deal with multiple origins, multiple peoples as equal beginners, right? To be able to do a weave from there, you know, I'm playing with this, right? I'm playing with this, but I don't know. What do you think?
Well, no. You said a lot. I guess the riff that I want to play as well, while I agree with much of what you're saying, I think, however, we have to deal with the issue of social political power, like the violent aspect of commodifying people, the violent aspect of takeover, of genocide. And while, you know, as a Baptist, you know, I'm looking at Roger Williams and that heritage through the lens of my own Christian formation as a Baptist person. But when I look at what Southern Baptists are doing now, what evangelicals have supported and endorsed through the lens of their Baptist doctrines and sensibilities, it to me is it's an affront to the gospel. It is cultural arrogance. It is religious arrogance that seems to be winning the day, at least in the American settler colonial context. And so I want to complicate that a little bit and push the dialogue simply to say, what do we do about this violent aspect of conquest, of thinking about whiteness through the lens of cooperation? Ultimately, I think that's the goal. But I do also think that if we don't address the fact that folks have been, you know, killed and maimed, and theft has been a part of that heritage, then we're not telling the full truth. We're not trying to live. We're not living into it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
There are multiple origins, but there was fratricide.
Absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely.
My friend Brad Braxton might be your friend too. You know, has the same. And I'll end with this. There are places in the Atlantic where the sharks still circle because they are accustomed to being fed.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's sobering. It's sobering to think about that. It's still being fed.
Yeah. I appreciate you, friend, and I appreciate this whole gathering, and I appreciate my colleagues and the leadership of the chapel at Howard, and our friend Kanika, who's made this happen. And you know, we are the founders of the Fourth American Republic, right? And it is a magnificent opportunity.
I want to allow you, Dr. Patel, and you, Dr. Gilbert, give the floor first to Dr. Patel and then to Dr. Gilbert to close us. But I always want to, I learned in Dr. Gilbert's class, to leave in a moment of hope. And so we are influenced by Josiah Royce, Martin King, who've presented to us this idea of beloved community, a space where those who are fully dedicated to the cause of loyalty, truth, and reality exist. Do you all believe, first Dr. Patel, then Dr. Gilbert, in this idea of an attained goal of beloved community within the context of interfaith collaboration from a Black perspective, or should we look elsewhere?
I mean, the answer to that is absolutely, right. I mean, I will just quote a famous hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings be upon him. And my sister Nisa Muhammad just chimed in with the power of this conversation. I hope that this hadith gives succor to her soul and everybody else is here. But the Rasulullah, the messenger of God, says, if the end is near and you have a sapling in your hand, plant it. It's that simple, right? Like if you can do any good work, do the good work. Do the good work. The Quran says over and over again, believe in me and do good work. Believe in me, do good work. There's no promise that you're going to build a kingdom from the good work. Your job is to do the good work. That is your job, right? If the end is near and you have a sapling in your hand, plant it. And I just think, honestly, there's like an awful lot of liberation in that. Because the saplings that we plant is what we humans are meant to do, and we may or may not build the most beautiful garden of all time. And effectively, I think God is saying that's not our job. Our job is to take the sapling in our hand and plant it. One more thing on this. There's another great story in the Islamic tradition on this. The story goes that the prophet Abraham was in the fire, being burned, and there was a woman in the circle around who went and got a pail of water and threw it on the fire. And there was a man who scoffed at her and said, do you really think that your little pail of water is going to put out the fire? And her response is, let it not be said that when God's prophet was in the fire, I did nothing. Let it be said I did what I could. I just think that's enormously liberating, right? Let us do what we can.
Well, I think in the last respect, we have to do proper social analysis. We have to face the fact that, as James Baldwin said, that not everything faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And so if we face this reality that we are in kind of a human predicament, that as a Christian or as a person who believes in God intervening on the human plane, then one can bear hope, or one can give hope, and one can embrace hope, because there is promise. There's always a promise. And, there are three scriptures I'll leave our listeners with. And I think rather in a unified way speaks to the nature of how this conversation has been moving, which has been fun for me. Three texts, Matthew 28:19 through 20. And we both come from religious communities that are proselytizing. How do we do that in a way that honors God and honors I think the best practices of our faith is the question we have to continue to wrestle with. So go Matthew 28:19 through 20, go to all nations and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey all things I have commanded you. This is Jesus speaking, according to the text. But what are those things that Jesus has commanded us to do? If we think about Scripture and its the whole counsel of it, it's grounded in love. And if we are making disciples, this is not an act of terrorism. This is not imperialism. This is an invitation to one who embodies what love is. 1 John 4:7 through 8. Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love, right? So that also centers my theological perspective on the world. And finally, the substance of my work, when thinking about preaching or proclamation in the Jesus tradition, is rooted in Luke chapter 4, verses 18 through 19. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoner and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. If faith is not rooted in some form of action, then I think it's impoverished at best, and it's of no use at worst.
So I gotta say, I know that look, I gotta say, just real
Okay.
quick, right? Like I understand that one of the reasons interfaith work is hard for some folks is because there are doctrines that are in competition. I get it. But my aesthetic on this is, I listen to you and I hear a trumpet and I want to respond with the saxophone, right? Or I hear drums and I want to respond. So I'm not minimizing the doctrinal differences. I'm just saying I see the beauty and the holiness, right? I hear Christian scripture and I want to respond with Quranic ayahs or Islamic hadith. And it's not because I don't believe in the doctrine of Islam. It's
right.
Because the way it washes over me is, oh, that's beautiful, and there's a holiness there, and there's something that I come from. There's something in my instrument that I want to share, right?
That's the beauty.
And that like that, there is an aesthetic there. And by the way, like it's not that white people can't do this, but I think of it as a Black aesthetic, right?
Yeah.
I think of it like I think of it as a Black aesthetic.
Right. Yeah.
No argument on that.
No, whatsoever. And our good friend Otis Moss III, I'm not sure if you know who he is, but his book, Blue Note Preaching in a Post-Soul World, it's just that. It's talking about the jazz of it all, the beauty of it all. And so it's been wonderful. Thank you.
Well, it's interesting that you all will mention Dr. Moss, as he is one of our keynote addresses tomorrow, and that's where we will conclude to just share briefly on the final bits of our schedule. We look forward to Drea Denor, Dr. Moss, and Dr. Rami Nashabi, who will be sharing in the idea of interfaith at work. And they will be responded by our faculty member, Dr. Bradford Grant. That event will take place tomorrow at 12 noon right here on YouTube. We'll be followed with a workshop by Dr. Kills, Dean of the Chapel at Morgan State, Dr. Adil, who serves as the Chair Emeritus of Islamic Studies Department at DePaul, and our student, Khadija Cisse, President of the MSA, Why Christians and Muslims Should Do Interfaith Work. We will conclude our workshop portion with Andrea Davis, Dr. Nichelle Guidry, Dean of the Chapel at Spelman College in Sydney, Montgomery, on how to create an interfaith event. And then we'll look at our final keynote in the evening, where we will discuss how to move forward, charting our future. Of course, please join us on Sunday, where our guest speaker is Cardinal Wilton Gregory, followed by a reflective discussion and dialogue, and on Monday with our interfaith practice of the Wellness Collective. We thank you again so much for joining us. Please at Howard U Chapel on all social media platforms. We look forward to using the hashtag Faith Service Justice. Enjoy your evening. Thank you so much for being with us.